Good morning. My name is Regan. Our reading is from Mark chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. The resurrection. Saturday evening, when Sabbath ended, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome went out and purchased burial spices so they could anoint Jesus' body. Very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise, they went to the tomb. On the way, they were asking each other, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" But as they arrived, they looked up and saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled aside. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in white robes, sitting at the right side. The women were shocked, but the angel said, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He isn't here. He has risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body. Now go and tell his disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you before he died." The women fled from the tomb, trembling and bewildered, and they said nothing to anyone because they were too frightened. This is the word of the Lord.
People are not doing well. I heard a mental health professional say that on the radio the other day. She was being interviewed, and her conclusion was that people are not doing well. Their mental health is not doing well. Because of the pandemic and how long it's gone on, other things in the world, people are internalizing fear and stress, and generally our mental health is not good. People are not doing well. She talks about fear and how fear becomes this thing that informs how we live and our decisions and how we interact with people. It bubbles below the surface. And I think it's true that fear does affect us. I mean, I have seen in myself and in others a tendency towards preferring isolation to being with other people when we really need to be with other people, and that's what we need right now. I have seen less patience, and I've felt less patience with people when what we need is more patience right now. I have found it difficult to see and hear people, and I think a lot of us are in that place. We have found it difficult to see and hear people. People are not doing well. I'm kind of largely unaware of this in my life. Fear is kind of this thing that I bury. And, I would like to get one of those T-shirts that say no fear. They're kind of old now, but I'd still wear it. No fear is kind of what I'd like to be known for, that narrative, that like, rah, just want to be one of those guys. And but when I dig a little deeper, I realize that fear does say hello to me. I look back a couple of years ago, well, quite a few years now, when I was preparing for ministry. And when I started preaching, I was like, I can't do this. I'm afraid of public speaking. How can I do this? Every time I got up, I felt paralyzed and terrified, actually. All those symptoms of fear came into my life, and I just didn't want to do it. And I thought, I've invested all this time in this education. I better go do something else. I'm going to go back to framing. So I went into Toastmasters, and that was the solution for all my problems. Actually, I do have lingering fears as well. I have a recurring dream that might be... who here has recurring dreams? Anyone else? I have a recurring dream. This is how it goes. I arrive here, and I get to church, and it's just about to start, and I realize that I'm preaching and I haven't prepared anything, that I have no sermon. That's one version of it. And then I go to my office, I go, I've got 10 minutes. I've got 10 minutes to prepare a sermon. The other version is, I don't even realize I'm not prepared, and I get up into the pulpit and I don't have anything. I've had that multiple times. So fear is buried in my life somewhere. I don't know if I deserve one of those t-shirts. But I think fear takes away the passion and adventure and joy in life. And I do find myself being a little less patient lately, slower to listen, faster to speak. And I wonder, maybe along with you, how are we doing? This is what fear is. Fear is an emotional reaction to a present or perceived threat. It's both present and perceived, and I think that's really important because the body responds whether it's present or perceived. Our body doesn't know the difference between that kind of threat. It responds in the same way. So we have physical reactions, whether it's present or perceived, to fear. Your heart starts to race. Maybe if you've come up to the pulpit and you don't have anything to say, your heart starts to race. It's very stressful. You ever done that? Anyone here? Steve. And you get nervous, right? I'm just kidding. You've always got something good to say. You get nervous and your palms get sweaty. We all know that symptom, right? That's a symptom of fear, sweaty palms. Or stomach churning, knots in your stomach, problems with digestion. And then when we start feeling fear, it gets worse because it kicks into this fight or flight syndrome that we know. Sometimes it's freeze, but usually fight or flight. And then adrenaline kicks in, and it gets worse from there because adrenaline's made for fighting lions, not for having good discussions with people. And your blood flow decreases to your brain, and you become more primitive. This is what happens when you have a tough conversation. You get really primitive and unsophisticated. We've seen it. Your heart rate and blood pressure increase. You start breathing faster. You know those difficult conversations when you're going to have it, you're just breathing hard, and you hope no one notices that you're breathing really hard. You're nervous. Maybe you want to ask someone a question. You don't want to ask, but you know you have to. And it gets tight in there. You start breathing hard. That's fear. Your muscles tense up. Your pupils dilate. That's so that you can see the prey or the animal that's chasing you more clearly. Your pupils dilate. And blood flows away from your extremities, so your hands feel all clammy and cold, and then you get all flushed, and digestion gets all weird. That's fear. And that fear can be simmering in us in a state of fear. And I wonder if you recognize any of those symptoms. We might not call it fear, but I'm convinced that many of us, most of us, are in a state of threat response to some degree right now. And it's important because our body doesn't know the difference between perceived and present threats. It responds. So in difficult times like this, with threats all over the place, there is a persistent state of fear. And it affects how we perceive and respond. And it affects our perception. It affects how we see the world and interact with the world. And I believe it actually shrinks life. Whoops. That's a surprise. Being in a state of fear causes us to live our lives in a posture that hurts relationships, that hurts well-being, and then ultimately hurts our community and society. Now, I think the Easter message is very concerned about fear because the resurrection confronts our fears. And the Easter account, if you read it this way, has fear all over it. There is fear all through this story. And today, the message of Easter in the book of Mark, we look at the resurrection in Mark, and it is about fear. You know, in the Gospel of Mark, there's these 3 women that go to the tomb, and they want to do something kind and loving for Jesus. because they're in pain. It's the last gesture. They want to take care of his body and anoint him and pour out their love for him even though he's passed. This is what they can do, and they want to do it. But these are three women with lots of reasons to be afraid. So think about this. Imagine this. They sat at a distance and watched Jesus be crucified. Is that enough to put you in a state of fear? I would be in a state of fear. That is a horrific thing to see. The pain, the suffering, the death, living through that. I mean, I believe they probably had PTSD, but it wasn't invented back then, so they probably didn't. But they've been through so much watching Jesus from a distance. And they were in a heightened state of fear. All of those symptoms were there. And they were grieving, and they were also fearing for their own lives, fearing for the lives of their family and their friends. They were really in a heightened state. I imagine them walking to the tomb, probably looking over their shoulders for Roman soldiers, wondering if they were going to come get them next because they were disciples. Wondering what was going to happen to their friends and other disciples. Were they going to be next at these intersections on crosses, being crucified? They were not doing well. Fear does that. Their vision was narrowed. Their hearing was impaired. So they come to the tomb in this state, already heightened, just totally on edge. Instead of finding Jesus there, they open it and they see the stone is rolled away and it's open, and there's an angel there. And they look at him. And verse 5 says, they were shocked when they took it all in. Shocked is a generous translation. Some translations say alarmed, amazed, frightened, affrighted. This is my favorite. They were affrighted. But Mark, what he's trying to communicate is that they were just terrified. They were terrified by what they saw. I wonder what their faces looked like. Their eyes were probably wide open. And here's the surprise. Woo! This is the fear face. Actually, I didn't want to show, I looked at real pictures and thought, I just don't know if that's appropriate. So I picked a cartoon. But the idea is the same. Eyes wide, whites showing, pupils small. That's the classic fear face. And I wonder what they looked like when they saw that angel. I think they showed this fear face. I think their eyes were wide open in astonishment and fear. And the angel tells them that Jesus is not there. He says, he has risen. He is not here. See, here is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. He said this, but did they hear it? That's what I wonder. Did they actually hear anything he said? Did they comprehend it in their heightened state of fear? This is what happened after he gave them the instructions. They went out and fled. Sorry, I keep giving you the peekaboo. They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Fight or flight? They chose flight. In other words, they ran for their lives. They were terrified. It's like they ran into a bear or a spider. Everyone runs from spiders, right? They ran. They were terrified. They flew from there. They were so scared, they were trembling. You know what happens? The reason people tremble? It's adrenaline, too much adrenaline, so much adrenaline that they're trembling. They ran, and they're in terror, and they said nothing. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The women and the disciples were in such a state of fear that I don't think they were able to see the resurrection for what it was. Did you know that the Bible and God are very concerned about fear? The Bible is very concerned about fear. The angel in Mark 16 said right away, do not fear. His first words. He's well aware of that. In Matthew 28, a different resurrection account, do not be afraid. First words. Jesus appears to the disciples and he says to them, do not be afraid. I know I've got this glorified body and I've just appeared and disappeared and walked through walls and stuff, but don't be afraid. Shepherds, at the beginning of the gospel story, Jesus' birth is announced and the shepherds on the field and the angel appears to them and says, do not be afraid, fear not. They're important words. They're words that recognize the place that fear plays in our lives and how it keeps us from seeing and hearing. When there is an abundance of fear, we cannot hear and we cannot see. Our vision is narrowed and our hearing is impaired. And we think of survival, fight or flight. Life shrinks. Now, this is an important point for me. Fear is a reaction to present or perceived threat. But for us, this idea of a perceived threat is so important in our reality today in the world that we live in. There are many perceived threats. And our response to that can shrink the world, not expand it. It feels like we're exposed to new threats every single day. The news tells us of wars, new strains of coronavirus, and new waves coming our way. It tells us of crimes that are happening in our neighborhoods and all over the country. It tells us of financial crisis and crashes and that we better be careful, we're going to lose everything. Warns us of environmental catastrophe just around the corner. These are all potential and present threats, but they put us in a state of fear and we don't even know it. We miss the awareness that we're in a state of fear, but it's there, lingering, informing our behavior and our thoughts, affecting how we see and hear. And it hinders us because it brings out our worst, not our best. And fear shrinks life. And I really think God is concerned about our relationship with fear. In 1 John chapter 4, where he talks about God is love, he goes on to describe what love looks like, what the gospel looks like. And then he talks about fear like it's the opposite of the gospel and love. The effect that love has on fear is this. In John 4:17-19, perfect love expels fear. Fear has no place with love. Fear hinders. It doesn't help. Fear shrinks life. It doesn't expand it. And in Hebrews chapter 13, the last chapter, his concluding words, he talks about the importance of love and how we live out the gospel. And in verse 6, he says, because the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. In 2 Timothy, what the Spirit of God gives us, in 2 Timothy 1:7, for God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. The Bible is concerned about our relationship with fear because fear shrinks life. And it keeps us, I think, from fully seeing and hearing the resurrection. Mark ends in a very interesting way. We've got the women fleeing in terror. Their eyes are wide. You can see the whites of their eyes. And the very last word of the book is afraid. Now, I got to comment on this. This is the proper ending of the book of Mark. Mark chapter 16, verses 1-8 is the proper ending of the book of Mark. If you look at your Bibles, you see alternate endings. It's not very normal in the Bible, but it's there. If your Bible doesn't have that, you can look at your footnotes and it'll say, some later manuscripts add these verses. And it's interesting because it's almost like the early church didn't like the angst that ending on fear left them in. It's a very interesting ending. I can imagine them asking this question, where's the good news of the resurrection here? We've got to end on a high note, like there's got to be some encouraging news here. Trembling and silence, we can't let it end there. But all of the best commentators, I haven't seen one that says anything different, agree that verse 8 is the proper ending for the book of Mark. Mark is always like that, right? The author, it's the shortest book. He's always quick and to the point. He does things differently. And it leaves you wondering, what happens next? That's weird. They're afraid. The tomb is empty. Jesus is alive. And they're afraid. And it's uncomfortable because it's unresolved and full of tension. The disciples were in a place of fear. They had trouble hearing and seeing the good news of the resurrection because they were in a state of fear. Their life had shrunk to survival. Fear shrinks life. I think this is a word for us today. People are not doing well. How are we seeing and hearing? Can we actually see the work of Jesus around us? Or are we in a state of fear so we cannot see it? How are we seeing the people around us? The people that disagree with us? Are we truly seeing them? Are we seeing past them because of the state that we are in? Do we love them and see them with eyes of the resurrection, with patience and goodwill? Or are we not seeing well? For me, I'm not sure how I'm doing because when I'm driving my car, things come out that you might not see, that I don't want you to see. I have less patience now, and I have a new ability. I can see into the souls of people. I can see by what they're driving and by their bumper stickers and flags exactly what kind of person they are. I know it. I can judge them completely. It's a new ability I have now. I don't know if I'm doing that well. I can see into their hearts. I judge them just like that. How are we hearing people around us? Because for me, I feel this tendency, maybe along with you, the people, when they disagree with me, canceled. Done. No time. Facebook friends, maybe I'll too passive-aggressive to unfriend, but I'll hide their profile. Canceled. Instead of entering into dialogue and hearing what they have to say. Fear has crept in and left us in this persistent state of fear. You know what I love about this ending in the book of Mark? It ends with fear. They were afraid. There's no hiding it. There's no denying it. They were afraid. They were in a state of fear. That's where they were at. Let's name it. It's there. That's where they were at. People are not doing well. How are you? How are you doing? The message of Easter, of the resurrection, is one that is very concerned about a relationship with fear. Can we see the resurrection in our persistent state of fear? Or is it causing us to miss it? Really, do we see the resurrection? The resurrection confronts our fears. Because the resurrection is hope, and hope expands life. It doesn't shrink life. Imagine a life of hope instead of fear. Imagine seeing with eyes of the resurrection, seeing people with eyes of the resurrection instead of eyes of fear. Imagine seeing and hearing people and life with the eyes and ears of the resurrection. Imagine living in a state of hope instead of a state of fear. This Easter, may you be confronted by the hope of the resurrection and see life and the world through the eyes of hope. Through the new life promised by the resurrection and the work that God is doing to restore all of creation. It's a way of seeing that is filled with hope. What if I see people with hope instead of fear? What if I have an eternal perspective on what God is doing? What if I see people as created in the image of God? What if I hear people and listen for their heart? What if I live without fear of death? This Easter, may you be confronted by the hope of the resurrection and see life and the world through the eyes of hope. Amen.